All right, all right. I'm going to turn things over to Mr. James Porter. He's a
How you doing, everybody?
local DJ and writer and musician. Go ahead, have fun, man.
How you feeling? All right. Hell of a performance, huh? All right, one more time. Chris Thomas King. All right. Yeah. Yeah. So, Chris, I enjoyed the performance, and also it's a good time to mention that I believe you have a book coming out. Am I correct?
Yeah, I've been working on a book for some years now, and the manuscript is finally in the final stages, and we're in the process of editing it and trying to find a publisher.
Yeah. And could you tell the folks exactly what it's about? Nice little description of it, or?
Yeah, the working title of my work is The Blues, the authentic narrative of my music and culture therewith. Well, that title says that the authentic narrative, which means that the narrative that we all know about this music that we call the blues, and the story that we've all been told and led to believe is a fiction. And I learned some years ago, as I began writing this work, that the blues did not have a history. It had never been told, and when I realized that, I knew that I couldn't, put the pen down, so to speak, until I, researched every detail and uncovered every truth that has been hidden from us. And I believe that that's, what the work represents. It represents the authentic narrative of my music and culture therewith.
Right, yeah. Yeah, because we were talking about, like, generally when the blues is discussed, history-wise, they tend to rely on a lot of myths, that they never did get to the bottom of. There's like very little, concrete facts that, can be put together. We're talking about that, and yeah, so this is basically a chance to right those wrongs, I take it, right?
Yeah, and I would love to be in a situation where I can just, write fiction and, fairy tales of my own, but sometimes as an African American, you don't have that luxury. You usually are trying to correct, these false narratives about, your culture and who you are. And so you got to kind of do that first before you can move on to, telling some fantastical stories. And yeah, and I think that there's going to be some time, I think, if you guys are patient with us, that if you have some questions and things, you want to draw some things out of me, I'll be happy to try to go anywhere you guys want to lead. But there's so much information, and I don't want to overload anyone with it. But I'll just tell you some fallacies that off the top that you can, highlight. The first fallacy is that the definition of the blues as being sad and depressed and down in the dumps. Well, let me ask you a question. Are you guys pretty down in the dumps and sad after this night's performance? So do I get an F on that? Because I think that Paxton and I, brought a lot of smiles to people's faces, so we must be doing it all wrong. But that's a fallacy that the blues is this sad, depressed music. That is the Anglo-English definition of our culture. And when I say our culture, I mean the African-American Creole culture of Louisiana. The proper definition is that it's a French definition, and the word blue means blue entertainment. And when you understand that it's blue entertainment, not blues, blue entertainment is kind of bawdy, Saturday night music that might be too sensual for polite company, and too rowdy, for polite company, and so to speak. So the French definition is like blue entertainment, like you might find in a burlesque show or on Bourbon Street or blue comics, that kind of thing. So, and it goes back to the word sacre bleu. It's kind of the creolization of an old French blaspheme called sacre bleu, and the Creole, shortened version of it is they just call it the blues, or we don't want you playing the blues in our respectable establishment kind of thing. Another fallacy is that the music came from the Mississippi Delta, and on close examination, it's impossible because no human beings lived in the Mississippi Delta really until the 20th century. And people think that those plantations have something to do with slavery. And there was never a slave in the Mississippi Delta in the history of the planet. There was never a slave. There was never anybody picked cotton during slavery time in the Mississippi Delta. It was just a safari of black bears, Florida panthers, wild wolves, and that type of thing. So, matter of fact, in the late 1800s, when people were playing the blues in New Orleans and in Louisiana, Mississippi was only 10% of Mississippi was occupied. So those are just a couple of fallacies that we don't have to argue about who was playing this note and that note. There was no note played in Mississippi Delta until the early 1900s, after the blues was already well established in Louisiana.
Yeah, we were talking because I read a couple chapters of the book, and I noticed that one thing that I noticed kept coming back up is that a lot of like white folklorists tend to take black music and only take what fits into their narrative. Like we were talking about, say, Lonnie Johnson, really sophisticated gentleman. He was like inspired all these, country bluesmen back in the time. However, when it came time for acoustic blues to be revived, they kind of passed over him because he was just like, a touch more, here I go use this word again, sophisticated, for the folkies to handle. Like I said, they didn't accept the whole culture. They just kind of like, wanted like their narrow view of it, and anybody who didn't fit in it, just pretty much just out of luck,
Yeah, Lonnie Johnson, if there's such a thing as the king of Delta blues, it would be Lonnie Johnson. And not only am I telling you that, but B.B. King told me that personally. But when you research what other musicians like Brownie McGhee have said, matter of fact, Robert Johnson, who everybody's familiar with, used to go around the Delta telling people he was Lonnie Johnson to get gigs. And Johnny Shine said that about Robert Johnson, and he used to ramble with Robert, and he said Robert would tell people that he was Lonnie Johnson or that he was related to Lonnie Johnson in order to get work. But all the Delta musicians, they learned from recordings that was floating around. Everybody, and one of Lonnie Johnson's biggest fans was Mississippi John Hurt. I think that's the only musician I ever heard that I could find in all my research that Mississippi John Hurt praised, because they kept trying to ask him where he got his music from or where he learned from or who inspired him, and he, was a man of few words anyway. But he lit up, when he talked about Lonnie Johnson and how that was his hero. But even Muddy Waters, would go and when he was 12, 10 years old, he would go and listen to a phonograph being played by one of the neighbors. And she would allow him to go over there and listen at the records and stuff like that. And that's how he got, turned on to the music. So it's a fallacy that the Delta musicians are somehow authentic folk musicians and the New Orleans musicians somehow are not. Lonnie Johnson played with his father and his brother in a family band. Now, most of his family he lost most of his family during affluenza in around 1917 or so. But his brother survived. His brother was called Rambling Johnson. And so he grew up firsthand. Like the definition of folk music by the folklorists is that it has to be an oral tradition passed down. It can't be written in a sheet music or learned at a conservatory. It also have to be music of illiterate or pre-literate community. And, all these kind of check marks. But Lonnie Johnson is an authentic folk musician by those definitions, whereas the Delta musicians learn from recordings, which would kind of make them not necessarily folk musicians if they're listening and replaying the record and learning how to play popular music. And the blues was popular in the 1920s. It was pop music.
Now, kind of bringing it full circle, you were saying in a recent interview with Living Blues that you were kind of like the folklorists when they got a load of you being a young black blues musician coming along in the '80s. You know, they were trying to like limit your thing too. You know, you had your ideas of what your music was, what blues music was. Everybody's trying to impose their ideas on on you about that.
Yeah, well, we're talking about folk. The reason we're talking about blues, but it's the folk definition of folk that was shackled onto the blues music that created this whole misconception of what this music represents. And what he just said to you is that I was discovered by a folklorist from the Library of Congress in 1979. And so I was the last of the Lead Bellies and the Muddy Waters or whatever to be discovered by a folklorist, like as some kind of authentic find, And they brought me to the attention of the world through our Hooley Records, a folk label out of Berkeley. And my first album right now is a part of the archive at the Smithsonian. And I just found that crazy because I was thinking I was on my way to Soul Train or something when I made my first record. I didn't know what folk was. I had no idea what folk was about. I was trying to figure out, when they're gonna play my record on the radio. I mean, when is it gonna, so I had different ideas, but there was a narrative that had been built that, even though I grew up for those of you that don't know, I grew up in a juke joint. My father had a blues club called Tabby's Blues Box, and he opened it in 1979, and so when I was 15 or 16 years old, that's where I really was introduced to the music as the family business for like 25 years or so. But what we understood about the music and what the culture was that we were doing was entirely different from what the quote-unquote blues mafia had established out there. And, it was like, I felt alienated really from the, from the popular narrative of what this music represents. I just didn't, even though it was something that I grew up in, locally I was fine. I knew my own identity. I knew what I was about. I knew what I thought my music represented. But out there was a narrative that had already been built that, was alienating. And you mentioned white folklorists, but it's black folklorists too, like Nora Hurston and Langston Hughes and people like that, the Harlem Renaissance. They were folks who also learned, they went to Harvard and learned the same stuff that John Lomax learned, which is a bunch of fairy tales and folklore about African American culture. And you just can't, the problem is when Francis James Child and these early folklorists began to try to use the same measuring stick that they used to measure English or Anglo folk music like Barbary Allen and music from the Appalachians that was still carrying on an old English tradition. They tried to use that same measuring stick to measure African American music and define it as folk. But that never existed in Africa. It never existed in African American music. We have no equivalent of that. So there's no such thing as African American folk music. It just didn't exist. You can't compare African music or African American music in particular with the music of 16th century milkmaids and plowmen, from Elizabethan England, It just don't translate. Our music has rhythm, multi-rhythms, polyrhythms, 3 or 4 melodies going on at the same time, and the function of the music is entirely different.
And also, too, another thing that the folklore seem to overlook is that the black culture, and particularly blues culture, believe it or not, is like an ongoing thing. It's not always, it might be based on the 78s, but it kind of moves on from that, and you're talking about people like rediscovering the old child ballads and whatnot. However, though, when they got access to the blues performers, that they seem to overlook that these guys were still current. Some of them the younger ones were still current. They still considered them current. They were even though they're doing a fairly archaic kind of music, they saw themselves right in line with whatever was happening. Kind of like what you just said about how when they discovered you at our Holy Records or what have you, you wanted to go on Soul Train. I mean, that's totally
I
understandable.
was shocked. I was shocked. And, we're in Chicago. Now, everybody around the world know that Chicago, has its say in this whole blues story. But I wish that Chicago would be more authentic if Chicago began its blues story, as the New Orleans musicians came up here, the Jelly Roll Morton, Tony Jackson, all the early pioneers, King Oliver, all those guys. King Oliver is one of the early great blues musicians. And he played, and that's the other fallacy. I mean, we all have this idea that W.C. Handy is somehow the father of the blues, or was thought to be the person who really brought this music to the fore. And he was a trumpet player. But no one in here probably can name another blues trumpet player. So how can you be, I mean, you're the father of the blues, and you didn't inspire another trumpet player? So, I mean, for King Oliver and Louis Armstrong and these people not to be considered blues musicians, and they called their music West End blues, Jelly Roll blues, Basin Street blues, the such and such a blues. Every song is a such and such a blues, and then it's also in the form. But because it's happy music and because it's upbeat and it don't fit the English Anglo definition, then it's discounted because it's too joyous. But it fits the French definition, of blue entertainment, because it was the kind of music that was played in speakeasies, and when drinking beer was like almost a death sentence or something, It was a major crime to be caught drinking a beer. Things we take for granted. Just dancing was outlawed, at many places for a very long time. And we take that for granted now. But when this music was defined and codified by these early folklorists and people, these things were taboo. Not just dancing, but even dancing interracially was totally forbidden. So the blues encouraged all kinds of vice and all kinds of things that we take for granted today. It was very progressive music that have, opened people up to the fact that there's nothing wrong with a little bump and grind.
Okay, does anybody have any questions for Mr. King?
When did you write I Want to Die with a Smile on My Face?
Probably 1988 or 89. It was released in 1990.
Yeah, I remember that song, and that's why I'm down here, and I didn't know any of this stuff about where you came from. So.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. And that song came out on my second album, which was released in 1990. And it's true. I was, you had to put quarters in the phone back then. And I ran out of quarters, and she kept hanging up, and I was so sick about
Thomas, though,
it. I'm the same guy.
So, yeah, but when did you add, or did you add it back that it was there before?
I had at the King. I was kind of, because I did hip-hop blues music and stuff, and a lot of festivals and people wouldn't have me, and I really couldn't work in America, so I moved to London and ended up moving to Scandinavia. I lived in Copenhagen for some years, and while I was in Copenhagen, I added the name King because Chris Thomas just didn't sound right in Scandinavia's two first names.
Blues guys with King, sure.
Yeah. So, anybody else got something you want to share?
Are you in Chicago this weekend?
I'm sorry?
Are you doing any other concerts while you're in Chicago for the weekend?
No, I played last night in Arlington Heights at a grand opening at a new venue there, a fabulous venue called Hey Noni, and you guys will be hearing about that. But no, I'm flying back to Louisiana tomorrow, and this was my main reason for being in Illinois. Was coming to be a part of this fantastic festival, the opening night. Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a question. Yeah, I have some issue with your contention. I guess one of my questions is what you call it a blues, and what is your connection with the motherland? Because we can clearly document that this really came from the motherland, and I just can't see your contention that it came from New Orleans. when we can show, there've already been connections with musicians in West Africa, and the connection is direct, the music is direct. Johnny Lucas and several other musicians have already went to West Africa, and they said, ask Johnny Lucas, how did you get our music? Having said that, I don't understand your contention. The music, blues came, again, we must understand blues. What is blues?
It's a very good question, and it's well, he's asking, he's saying that I'm on stage saying that blues is not connected to the motherland, Africa, and he's saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm getting your question wrong, and he's saying that John Lee Hooker and other musicians, you know, said that they got the music or somehow from Africa, and that there's African.
The musicians in Africa asked them how did they get their music.
And they said they got it from John Lee Hooker, or John Lee Hooker got it from him? Okay. So this is where you are misinformed, you know, I would say. I'll use Ali Frakatur as an example. Ali Frakatur, you know who I'm talking about? Ali Frakatur, he was a West African musician who became popular in the 90s. He made some recordings with Taj Mahal, with Gatemouth Brown, and Corey Harris and some other people. And he was presented out there by these folklorists that I'm talking about here, who misinterpret our whole culture. He was presented because they believed that this music came from the jungles of Africa. And so they had to go to the jungles of Africa. They had to find some primitive music in Africa as kind of like a jumping off point or a primogenitor to the blues. And so he became the embodiment of that. But when you listen to Ali Frakatur's music, Ali Frakatur is influenced by Robert Pete Williams from Louisiana. He's also influenced by John Lee Hooker, as opposed to John Lee Hooker being influenced by him. So he is a guy who was picking the guitar and was playing in an African tradition that's totally in the tradition of his culture in West Africa. But he began moving into the blues because the blues kind of opened up Europe for him and opened up ears to his music. And he saw that avenue, and he worked with this, I forget, what was this guitar player who did the Cuban, Roy Cooder. Roy Cooder produced his records, and I went to Africa myself, and I went to Nigeria, to Lagos and Abuja, and I had these discussions with them, and I tried to, and this was some years back when I first began my research, and I was sharing with them that the blues came from them, and that I was happy to be, you know, to be in Africa, you know, and to be, you know, learning from them and sharing with them. And they told me they don't have anything to do or any connection with what I was doing. And this Delta blues stuff, they had no idea where that came from. They totally rejected it. It's not from their culture. There was more Africans during the slave trade that went to Brazil and went to the Caribbean. Only about 3% of the Africans came to America. So if the blues came from Africa, why would it start in Louisiana and not say in Brazil or in Haiti or in some other place? If you go to Africa today, you can't find the blues. When I go to Africa today, I go to the clubs, they just doing hip hop. It's straight up hip hop. They just emulating American culture.
What I'm saying is that there's something innate.
This is what
Goes anywhere they go.
you can theorize, we can disagree. We can disagree and theorize about what I can tell you for a fact that came from Africa is the instruments. The instruments that make up the early blues, the classic blues, is the trumpet, the clarinet, the trombone, the tambourine, and the string instruments like the guitar and the banjo. And these are all African instruments. The trumpet is totally an African instrument. So when you hear King Oliver playing that trumpet, that's an African instrument that he's playing. That instrument is not European. It has nothing to do with Europe. the guitar has nothing to do with Europe. It came from Africa into Spain in the 8th century. And then in New Orleans, in Louisiana, at Congo Square, people believe that there's a banjo at Congo Square, that image of, people have been saying for years that they played the banjo. They didn't play the banjo in Congo Square, they played guitars, because guitars, banjo doesn't have a sound hole in it. But when you guys Google that image that was drawn from the eyewitness who drew the dancers at Congo Square, he drew a guitar. And it's important that he drew a guitar because Spain ruled Louisiana. And so the guitar came to America from Spain, and it came, black conquistadors won those ships. They came as explorers. They didn't all come as slaves. From the 15th century to St. Augustine, all the way into Louisiana, it was a totally different culture. And so the guitar is very important to the connection. Now, the Carolinas, you might find a banjo, but Louisiana, it was a Spanish territory, even though they spoke French, yes. But the Spanish crown ruled Louisiana much longer than the French. And I don't want to get long-winded, but we can disagree if we want to disagree, but I researched all that writing about Africa, and this music does not exist in South Africa, it don't exist in North Africa, it don't exist in West Africa, and most Africans will tell you that it's not, they might have grew up on Motown lately, but this music is not African.
Well, my contention is, I want to be in relate to the point. My whole contention is that, again, we're talking about a form. And one of John Lee Hooker's most famous quotes is that the blues has no chords, it has no form. And this has been a whole issue with people like John Lee Hooker, that they were playing music that was so connected to the motherland because they were untutored. Again, this form is 12-bar blues, 8-bar blues.
I don't prescribe to the form of I don't think blues has any form.
I'm saying that this is basically what's been codified as blues.
Yeah, but that's wrong. That's wrong. That's wrong. I mean, what are the chord progressions to play rock and roll or to play any style of music? It's ridiculous. 12 bars or 32 bars or 48 bars, you can do how many bars you want. There's no rules to it. And those restrictions, I agree with you there.
We have another question over here.
Supposed to be the last one.
I give you your answer to both of you. Here we are two black people discussing about something to belong to them in a foreign language. So you got to think about it, and then you get your answer, both of you.
Well, the original language of the blues is...
No, I'm not talking about the original language. I say, if you look at the original language yourself, and in the original language, you both discussing about something that belongs to both of you, and you don't agree. And I said the answer lies in the fact that we're discussing in a foreign language.
I see your point, but the discussion is about the blues, and I'm saying the original language for the blues is a Louisiana Creole. That's the original language, and that's the original definition. It's a lap steel guitar, and it's a 1929 old lap steel, and it's not much to explain about it other than it's wicked. And it just proves that, size is not everything, you know what I mean? But I enjoyed you guys. I know we got to get out of here, and I look forward to coming back. Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming, everybody.
When the book is out.
Thanks, everybody.
How about it for Chris Thomas King, James Porter interviewing? And when the book comes out, I promise to the gentlemen that, have a polemic they want to raise about the issue, that we'll invite you back and we can hash it out and talk about it. Thank you for the dialogue. We really appreciate your input here. How about it one more time for Jerron, Blind Boy Paxson, and Chris Thomas King, everybody. How about it? Thank you so much. Remember, there's a lot of programming happening all weekend long, and you don't want to miss it. Be safe going home. We bid you safe passage.
You ain't